It was supposed to be just another quiet afternoon in Sonny's cafe, the kind of place where people came to relax, read, or catch up with friends. The air smelled like fresh coffee, sweet pastries, and toasted sandwiches. The soft hum of conversation mixed with the gentle hiss of the coffee machines, creating a warm and cozy atmosphere. At a small table in the corner, a man sat alone. He was tall and strong, with broad shoulders and arms covered in dark tattoos that curled around his skin like stories waiting to be told. He wore a black leather jacket, slightly worn at the edges, and dark jeans. His boots were heavy, the kind that made a slight thud when he walked. He held a tiny cup of espresso in his hand, sipping it slowly. The man's face was calm, his eyes steady, and his expression unreadable. He didn't seem nervous or distracted. Instead, he looked like someone who knew exactly what he was doing. But there was something about him that made people take a second glance. Some whispered quietly. Others simply avoided looking at him. Across the street, standing by his patrol car, Officer Harris watched the man through the cafe window. His sharp blue eyes narrowed. He had been an officer in this town for years, and in his experience, people like that tattooed, dressed in black, sitting alone usually meant trouble. Harris adjusted his belt, feeling the weight of his badge against his chest. "This guy doesn't belong here," Harris muttered to himself, his jaw tightening. He wasn't sure what it was, but something about the man rubbed him the wrong way. Maybe it was the tattoos. Maybe it was the way he sat so still, too still. Or maybe it was just because Harris had seen guys like him before, big, tough, and always looking for trouble. Inside the cafe, the man sipped his coffee without a care in the world. He glanced at the people around him but didn't stare too long. The waitress walked by, offering a friendly smile. He nodded in return, polite but distant. He wasn't there to make friends. But Harris wasn't buying it. He was sure this guy was up to something. With a deep breath, Harris made up his mind. He was going in. The small bell above the cafe door jingled as Harris pushed it open. The warm air from inside rushed out to meet him, filled with the rich scent of roasted coffee beans. The cafe wasn't too busy, just a few students typing away on their laptops, an elderly couple sharing a plate of cookies, and a group of teenagers laughing in the corner. But Harris's eyes were fixed on one person only. The man didn't look up right away, as if he hadn't noticed the officer enter. But Harris knew better. He could tell the man was aware of everything around him, even if he didn't show it. Harris walked over to the counter, pretending to look at the menu. "Black coffee. No sugar," he said to the barista. As he waited for his drink, he stole quick glances at the man in the corner. He was still sitting there, calm as ever, taking small sips of his espresso. The officer took his coffee and casually walked over. He stood just a few feet away from the table, clearing his throat. "Hey," Harris said, his voice firm but polite. The man finally looked up, his dark eyes meeting Harris's gaze. There was something in them, something deep and quiet, like he had seen things most people hadn't. "Yeah," the man said simply. Harris studied him for a moment. "Haven't seen you around here before," he said, taking a sip of his coffee. The man shrugged, setting down his cup. "Just passing through," he replied. His voice was low and calm, not the kind Harris expected from someone who looked like him. No roughness, no anger. Just simple and steady. Harris frowned slightly. He wasn't used to people like this being so collected. Usually, they got nervous, defensive, or tried to act tough. But this guy wasn't giving him anything. "You staying long?" Harris asked, trying to keep his tone casual, but inside, he was tense. He wanted to figure this guy out. The man tilted his head slightly. "Not sure yet," he said, his lips curling into a small smile, as if he found the whole conversation amusing. Harris didn't like that. He set his coffee down on the table and leaned in a little. "Listen, we don't get a lot of strangers in this town. People like to know who's around." The man's smile didn't fade. He nodded slowly. "That's fair." For a moment, there was silence. The cafe buzzed with life around them, but at that table, it felt like time had slowed down. Harris crossed his arms, his eyes never leaving the man's face. "So, what do you do?" The man chuckled softly. "A little bit of everything," he said. Harris raised an eyebrow. "That's so? And what brings you here?" The man took another sip of his espresso, letting the question hang in the air for a second too long. "Just needed a break," he finally said. Harris didn't believe him. Not for a second. His gut told him there was more to this guy than he was letting on. He just had to figure out what it was. As Harris stood there, the cafe door opened again, and a young woman walked in, holding a large stack of books. She stumbled slightly, and before Harris could react, the man in the leather jacket was already on his feet. With surprising speed, he reached out and caught the books before they hit the ground. "Careful," he said gently, handing them back to the woman. She looked up, surprised, and thanked him with a nervous smile. Harris watched closely. That wasn't what he expected at all. He had thought this guy would ignore the situation, maybe even make it worse. But instead, he had helped without hesitation. The man sat back down, like nothing had happened. Harris didn't know what to think anymore. Maybe this guy wasn't trouble after all, or maybe he was just really good at hiding it. "Enjoy your coffee," Harris muttered, stepping back. The man nodded. "You too, officer." Harris walked out of the cafe, feeling more confused than when he walked in. Maybe he was wrong about this guy, or maybe not. Either way, he wasn't going to let his guard down just yet. From his table, the man watched Harris leave, a knowing smile on his face. He had seen people like Harris before, always judging, always assuming. And they always learned the hard way that things weren't always what they seemed. As he took another sip of his coffee, he thought to himself, people are so quick to judge, but they never really know the full story. As Officer Harris walked into the cafe, the sound of his heavy boots filled the quiet space. People glanced up from their tables, their conversation slowly dying down. The soft clinking of spoons against coffee cups was the only sound left in the room. The air felt different now, tense and uncertain. Harris's sharp eyes locked onto the man sitting in the corner. The tattooed man didn't flinch, didn't shift in his seat. He simply lifted his cup and took another slow sip, his face calm and unreadable. He looked like someone who had been through a lot but wasn't about to show it. Harris walked closer, his hand resting on his belt. He had been watching this man for a while now. Something about him didn't sit right. The tattoos, the leather jacket, the quiet confidence, it all screamed trouble in Harris's mind. "You," Harris said, his voice firm and loud enough for everyone to hear. "What's your deal? Sitting here all day, taking up space." The cafe fell even quieter. The waitress behind the counter froze in the middle of wiping a glass. A couple near the window exchanged nervous glances. No one wanted to get involved, but everyone was watching. The tattooed man looked up slowly. His piercing blue eyes met Harris's glare without fear. He set his coffee cup down carefully, wiping his fingers on a napkin before speaking. His voice was deep, steady, and polite. "Just having coffee," he said. Harris narrowed his eyes, not satisfied with the answer. "I've seen guys like you before," he said, his tone dripping with suspicion. "Thugs. Always causing trouble." The man didn't react the way Harris expected. There was no anger, no sudden defensiveness. Instead, the man gave a faint smile, one that didn't quite reach his eyes. "You've got it all wrong, officer," he said calmly. Harris crossed his arms over his chest, his muscles tense. He didn't like being challenged, even if it was subtle. The man's calmness irritated him. Troublemakers usually got nervous around cops. This guy? He looked too sure of himself, too comfortable. "You don't belong here," Harris continued. "People around here don't like strangers hanging around, especially ones like you." The man leaned back in his chair, his hands resting on the table. He didn't look threatened at all. If anything, he seemed amused. "I didn't know sitting in a cafe was against the law," he said, raising an eyebrow. A small murmur spread through the cafe. The barista glanced at Harris, then back at the tattooed man. Some customers shifted in their seats, pretending to mind their own business but secretly listening to every word. Harris clenched his jaw. He wasn't used to people talking back to him. Most people would have apologized or walked out by now. But this guy? He was just sitting there, cool as ever. "Don't play games with me," Harris said, his voice getting lower, more threatening. "I know trouble when I see it." The man sighed and shook his head slightly. "Officer, I'm just here for coffee. I'm not bothering anyone." "Is that a crime?" Harris wasn't buying it. He didn't trust people who looked like this guy: tattoos, tough appearance, acting too calm. He had seen it before. They acted all nice until they didn't. The officer stepped closer, looming over the table. "Listen, I don't know what you're up to, but I suggest you finish your coffee and move along." The man didn't move. He just stared at Harris, his blue eyes locked onto the officer's face. The tension in the air thickened, and everyone in the cafe felt it. The waitress behind the counter glanced nervously at the door, as if hoping someone else would walk in and break the moment. "Or what?" the man finally asked, his voice still calm but now with a hint of challenge. Harris's face hardened. He wasn't used to people questioning him. "Or I'll make you," he said coldly. The tattooed man nodded slowly, as if thinking it over. Then, without breaking eye contact, he reached for his coffee cup and took another sip. "You really don't like me, do you?" he asked. Harris didn't answer right away. He could feel the eyes of everyone in the cafe on him, waiting to see what he would do next. He hated feeling out of control, and this guy was making him look bad in front of everyone. The man placed his cup back down and leaned forward slightly. "You think you know me, but you don't," he said quietly. "You see tattoos, and you think trouble. But not everyone is what they seem, officer." Harris scoffed. "Yeah? And what are you, then?" The man smiled again, but this time it felt different, like he knew something Harris didn't. "Just a guy enjoying his coffee," he said. Harris stood there, fuming. He wanted to do something, say something, but deep down, he wasn't sure if he was right about this guy. The man's calmness, his quiet confidence, it was unsettling. A soft voice broke the silence. "Officer, is everything all right?" It was the barista, her voice shaky but polite. Harris blinked and turned to her. "Yeah," he said, forcing a smile. "Everything's fine." But it wasn't. He felt like he had lost, somehow. He looked back at the tattooed man, who was still sitting there, still sipping his coffee, still looking at him with those calm blue eyes. Harris didn't like it one bit. "Just, don't stay too long," Harris muttered before turning and walking out of the cafe. The moment he stepped outside, he let out a heavy breath. What was it about that guy that got under his skin so much? Inside the cafe, the man watched Harris leave, a knowing smile playing on his lips. He picked up his cup again and took another slow sip. The customers around him began talking again, the tension slowly melting away. But one thing was certain, Officer Harris wasn't done with him yet. And the tattooed man? He wasn't going anywhere. Officer Harris leaned in even closer, his eyes narrowing. His hand rested on his holstered weapon, his fingers twitching slightly. He wasn't going to let this guy get away without some answers. "Don't play games with me, tough guy," Harris said, his voice sharp and full of authority. "What are you hiding?" The cafe felt smaller now, quieter. Every person in the room could sense the tension. Even the hum of the coffee machine seemed softer. The tattooed man looked at Harris with calm eyes. He didn't seem worried or scared. Instead, he looked amused. Slowly, he put his coffee cup down on the table without making a sound. Then he leaned back in his chair, folding his arms across his chest. "I'm not hiding anything," he said in a steady, even tone. "But you seem eager to find something." Harris's jaw tightened. He didn't like the way this guy talked, too relaxed, too sure of himself. It was like he didn't take Harris seriously. That made Harris angry. He was used to people getting nervous when he questioned them, stammering out excuses. But this man? He just sat there, cool and calm. The people in the cafe exchanged worried looks. The waitress behind the counter whispered something to the barista, and a man sitting by the window glanced nervously toward the door. It felt like something big was about to happen, and nobody wanted to be caught in the middle of it. Harris took a deep breath, trying to stay in control. "Look," he said, his voice lower now but still firm, "I know your type. Sitting here all day, acting like you own the place. I've seen it before." The tattooed man raised an eyebrow, his lips curling into a slight smirk. "Is that so?" he asked, his voice calm and polite. "Well, officer, I think you're mistaken." Harris didn't like that smirk. It made him feel like he was being laughed at. He straightened up, his hand still on his belt. "I don't think so," he shot back. "I've been doing this job for a long time. I know when someone's up to no good." The tattooed man didn't answer right away. He picked up his coffee cup again, took a slow sip, and placed it back down. Then, out of nowhere, a buzzing sound filled the air. Everyone looked toward the man. It was his phone. He glanced at the screen for a second. His face didn't change, but something about the way he looked at it made Harris even more suspicious. The man turned the phone over and put it back in his pocket. And then, there it was, that smirk again. Harris felt his patience wearing thin. "What was that?" he demanded. "Who are you texting?" The man shook his head, almost like he was laughing at Harris without actually laughing. "Relax, officer," he said smoothly. "Just a message. Nothing to worry about." Harris wasn't convinced. "Let me see your phone," he ordered, stepping closer. The man's expression didn't change. He simply leaned back in his chair and looked up at Harris. "Sorry," he said, "but that's personal." Harris's grip on his belt tightened. He could feel his frustration growing. Why was this guy so calm? Why wasn't he nervous? Most people would have given up their phone without question. The cafe felt even more silent now. The customers were holding their breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Even the waitress had stopped moving, her eyes wide with worry. The tattooed man watched Harris carefully. "You seem awfully interested in my phone," he said softly. "Why is that, officer? Do I look like a criminal to you?" Harris didn't answer right away. His mind was racing. Something about this guy was off, but he couldn't put his finger on it. The tattoos, the leather jacket, the calm attitude, it all made Harris uneasy. The man leaned forward now, resting his elbows on the table. His blue eyes were sharp and clear, looking right into Harris's. "Tell me something, officer," he said in a quiet voice. "Do you always judge people by how they look?" Harris opened his mouth to speak, but the words didn't come out right away. The man's question caught him off guard. For a split second, he wasn't sure what to say. "Listen," Harris finally said, his voice a little less sure now. "I just don't like strangers hanging around too long." The tattooed man nodded slowly. "Fair enough," he said. "But I'm just here for coffee. That's all." Harris stared at him, trying to figure him out. The man didn't look guilty. He didn't look scared. In fact, he looked completely in control. And that made Harris even more frustrated. Just then, the man's phone buzzed again. This time, Harris reached for it, his patience snapping. "Let me see that," he demanded. The man's hand moved quickly, covering his phone and holding it firmly. "Easy, officer," he said, his voice still calm but now with a slight warning in it. "You don't have the right to take my phone." Harris glared at him. "You don't get to tell me what my rights are," he said sharply. The man tilted his head slightly. "Actually," he said, "I do." Harris frowned. "What's that supposed to mean?" The man didn't answer. Instead, he smiled again, took another sip of his coffee, and leaned back in his chair. Harris's gut told him something wasn't right. This guy wasn't just some random person sitting in a cafe. He was too smart, too calm. He acted like he had nothing to worry about. And that made Harris worry even more. The customers were still watching closely, their eyes darting between Harris and the tattooed man. It felt like everyone was waiting for something big to happen. Harris clenched his fists, feeling the heat rise in his chest. He didn't like being tested like this. He had to figure out who this guy really was and fast. The man, meanwhile, sat quietly, looking as if he had all the time in the world. He glanced at his watch, then at Harris. "Well, officer," he said, "are we done here? Or do you want to keep staring at me?" Harris gritted his teeth. He wasn't done yet. Not by a long shot. Officer Harris had had enough. His patience was gone. His face was red, and his fists were tight. The tattooed man was too calm, too sure of himself. Harris couldn't stand it anymore. "Enough of this!" Harris shouted, his voice echoing through the cafe. Before anyone could react, he reached out and grabbed the man's arm, yanking him to his feet. The table shook, and the coffee cup tipped over, spilling dark liquid across the wooden surface. A gasp filled the room as people stared in shock. "You're under arrest for loitering and resisting," Harris barked, his grip tight on the man's arm. The cafe was silent. All eyes were on them. The waitress covered her mouth, and a few customers whispered nervously. Everyone could feel the tension. But just as Harris started to pull the man towards the door, something unexpected happened. The man didn't struggle. He didn't panic. Instead, his voice changed. It was calm, but this time it was different, strong, steady, and full of confidence. "I'd think twice about that, Officer Harris," the man said, looking straight into his eyes. Harris stopped, his grip loosening just a little. There was something in the man's tone that made him hesitate. It wasn't fear. It was power. Slowly, the man reached into his jacket pocket. Harris tensed, ready for anything. But the man didn't pull out a weapon. Instead, he took out a sleek leather wallet. With a calm hand, he flipped it open and held it up. Inside was an ID card, shiny and official looking. Harris stared at it, and his face paled. The name on the card hit him like a punch to the gut. Jacob Hartley, defense attorney. The cafe erupted in whispers. "A lawyer," someone muttered. "No way," another person said. Harris blinked, his mouth slightly open. His grip on Jacob's arm loosened even more. You're a lawyer," he stammered, his voice no longer full of power. Jacob straightened his jacket, brushing off Harris's hand like it was nothing. His blue eyes locked onto the officer's face, cold and sharp. "Not just any lawyer," Jacob said smoothly. "The kind who defends cases like this. So unless you want your badge on the line, I suggest you apologize." The words hit Harris hard. His mind raced. He had messed up big time. His face turned red again, but this time not from anger. It was from embarrassment. The people in the cafe were still watching, whispering, staring. Harris could feel their eyes on him, judging him. He swallowed hard, feeling the weight of the moment.